Welcome back to another episode of Mad in Love, the podcast where we dive into the complexities of relationships, the path to healing, and the journey to personal growth. I'm your host, Dr. David Hawkins, and today we are back with another episode of Dr. Hawkins Reacts, and Jonathan Reacts too, I think, where we explore the challenging topics of emotional abuse. Again, joining me is Jonathan Glover and our producer, Katie Buckley, who has compiled some posts on emotional abuse from the Reddit community. Katie, are you ready to present what you've found?
I think so. Just a warning, some of these could be a little bit of a trigger warning, just talking about emotional abuse and how it could affect people. I was curious to just find out what are people's views on emotional abuse and how does it affect in the clinical setting for a lot of people who are experiencing these traits. So I went and I did a deep dive, and some of these posts are maybe 2 years ago, some of them a couple months. So it's not really a timing thing, but I found the information to be interesting enough to bring to your attention, Dr. Hawkins and Jonathan, to get your reactions on how you feel about it, and also what would you say or do differently if this was your client. So the first one is a question written by Boodle. So let's call it Noodle. And the question is signs of emotional abuse, therapist and client perspectives. This person wrote, there are endless videos on the internet about emotional abuse and manipulation, but I'm curious about what signs a therapist might look for to determine emotional abuse is taking place. So is there any therapist here? What signs clue you into emotional abuse in intimate relationships? If you suspect it, do you call it out? From the client perspective, have you ever learned that your behavior in intimate relationships was abusive? If so, can you share more about that experience? It goes on a little bit. There's two responses to this post that I found interesting. The first one is a little longer, so I'm going to actually go to the one written by someone who I assume is a clinician. And this person said, I generally let my clients who are adults determine if their situation is emotional abuse. I try to get them to define abuse, then determine if their situation meets their own criteria. Here's the thing, though. It generally doesn't make much difference whether the client defines their situation as abusive or not. Almost to every person, even if a client decides if they are in an abusive situation, the real question becomes, what will I do about it?
I have a really strong negative reaction, Katie and Jonathan, to that person if they're a clinician and if they are saying to the client, look, you define whether it's emotionally abusive or not. Your reaction is what's most important. I don't have any opinions on the matter. And if you think it's abuse, then it's abuse. I think that's totally wrong. Um, Certainly, I think the client's perspective is of utmost importance, but we as clinicians, we with the experience, we bring something to bear on the situation. And there are different traits and different situations that we would say that really is abusive. And I'll talk about that in a few more minutes. But my first reaction to that clinician is, come on, that's a cop out. You can bring your perspective to bear. You can help this person to discern and determine whether it really is abusive and why it might be abusive. And so that's my first reaction. I've got more, but Jonathan, what do you think?
It's not very trauma informed. One of the effects of emotional abuse, of psychological abuse, and it's usually over a period of time, is to erode the victim's sense of self and really kind of confuse what's going on. Is this happening or not? Am I crazy or not? And the idea of sort of letting the victim decide if it is or not, or defend whether, or even just have to go into explaining if they think it's abusive or not, is really problematic. That's the reason why they're there. I mean, that's what I'm assuming is the reason why I'm talking to them is for them to get a sense of what's going on, get help with determining, is there a name for this? What are the effects of this?
Yep.
It's also, as a clinician, it's my job to determine, is what is going on with this individual, is this an effect of the relationship? Is it an effect of the environment? Or is this something psychological? Is there something, is that with brain chemistry or a diagnosis of their own? And I need to be able to determine the source of these symptoms. That's part of my job as a clinician. It would be crazy to think you go into your doctor's office and they say, well, whatever you think is wrong with you, we'll just go with that.
Furthermore, Jonathan, I know you clinicians who have had experience in this field have had what I'm about to describe happen. I look at this person and I'm doing an evaluation, a marriage assessment, which we do a lot of. And I watch this perpetrator be incredibly dismissive of this victim's situation and their reaction to something. And I name that and I say, oh my goodness, you were just dismissed in a profound way. And the victim says to me, and I've had this happen hundreds and hundreds of times, she starts crying and she says, oh my goodness, it is so validating to have you name what I just experienced. Now, the perpetrator, of course, is dismissive and says, oh no, nothing just happened. And I say, oh, something just happened. I just noticed that what she said, I'll use gender she, he, what she just said, you just dismissed and put her down and said, no, that's not what happened. And it happened. Anyway, she cries, she feels heard, she feels validated, and then there we are. We as clinicians, when something like that happens, we've got this experience, this breadth of knowledge that we can say, I just saw it, this thing we would call emotional abuse. I just saw it happen right in front of me. I'll stop with this, Jonathan. I then often will say, does that happen, what I just noticed in this marriage assessment? Does that happen in your life? Or is that unusual? And of course I'm leading the situation. And she always, not rarely, not sometimes, always says, oh my gosh, that, what you just named, happens all the time. All right. We have to bring that kind of experience to bear, and we've got to name it, we've got to identify it, and we've got to say that is not only troublesome, it's abusive. And when we do that, I think we've helped her in so many ways. We're also helping him. Like, look, what you're doing is harmful. It's damaging. So
go back to the initial question. I think, Katie, did you say it was, how do you, as a clinician, determine if a client is experiencing emotional abuse? Was that the question? How do you kind of go about determining that?
Signs clue you in to emotional abuse in intimate relationships, and if you suspect it, do you call it out? So,
and you do. We need to call it out. I'll go ahead and name. I talk about this a lot, so you both have heard me say this more and more and more and more in my experiences when I am interacting with victims of emotional abuse. Where I notice the emotional abuse really, really happens, it happens intensively, is when she brings a concern to him right there at that intersection. Right there, when he becomes defensive, dismissive, and dominant. I've talked about those 3 Ds a lot in my different videos. That's when crazy making happens. So she brings a concern to him. Hey, I don't like it when you're late. Hey, I don't like it when you walk out of the room when I'm talking. Hey, I don't like it when, and then fill in the blank. Right there, emotional abuse. I mean, walking out of the room when she's talking, if that's a pattern, that's also emotional abuse. But when she brings up the concern and her concerns are totally dismissed, they are devalued, and she is made to feel crazy for even bringing the concern to him, that's where the emotional abuse gets amplified. She's made to feel crazy. She's made to, she's blame shifted. All kinds of really troubling things happen. And I don't know if you do this, Jonathan, but I watch for that more and more and more. I watch for what happens when you bring your feelings to him. What happens at that moment in time? And invariably, if there's chronic patterns of emotional abuse and domination and narcissistic abuse, it is his needs and values trump hers. They dominate hers. And all of a sudden now his reaction becomes even more paramount.
This is a good segue because the next answer to that original post talks a little bit about what you're saying. This is from a client's perspective, but takes a little bit of a twist. So this person said, I feel like I have lived through emotional abuse and manipulation from my partner. I say feel because I'm not sure if it qualifies as abuse. I do know some of my partner's behavior is unacceptable. I've talked about this to my therapist and asked if it was abuse. They don't want to give me an answer. They say they can't determine if the person is an abuser because they have not seen them in person and have not talked to them. My therapist doesn't want to diagnose, and this is in quotes, my partner. I intellectually could understand their perspective. When I ask if such and such situation was abuse,
Katie, Jonathan's having a reaction here, and I think it's a good reaction. Maybe pause for a second.
Not to the right, not to the writer, not to the poster here, but to whoever their therapist is. Naming abuse is totally different from diagnosing somebody. That's not what they're talking about. They're asking, is this thing that's happening to me abusive? What is this thing that's happening to me? Why do I feel this way? I don't know why you wouldn't answer that question.
I had a feeling you guys would be riled up when I read these.
Oh, it's totally irresponsible, and it shows. Oh gosh, Katie, it also shows, it gives evidence to me that this person lacks the kind of experience needed and the credibility needed to face these kinds of situations. I would gently disagree with you a tiny bit, Jonathan, not to quibble about the word diagnosis, but when a person goes into a doctor and has a headache, the doctor will say, oh, you've got a headache. Clearly, you've got a headache. So in a sense, that's diagnosing. You've got a headache. Now, the origins of the headache, is it brain trauma? Is it a concussion? Is it migraine? I mean, what it is. But when we say, that's abusive. Now, does this person have narcissistic personality disorder? There we're talking about a diagnosis. But my goodness, every day I step into a situation and say, my goodness, that has all the hallmarks of emotional abuse. Now, I don't diagnose in the sense, I mean, I will if it turns out that they have all the markers of NPD or BPD or antisocial, whatever. But I think in a way we're also diagnosing, or we're defining a problem. How about if we use that language? We're defining this is a real problem, and it may take the form of NPD. It may take some other form, but yeah, it's emotional abuse. If there's a pattern of defensiveness, domination, dismissiveness over time, yeah. So, Jonathan, agree? Disagree?
Oh yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. I was just responding to the word diagnosis that the
Okay.
therapist had used.
Cool.
Yeah.
So to
And it
continue,
takes courage on our parts, and that's why we catch some flack, but we will step into this. We don't step back and go, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. No. And by the way, studies show this. The victim of emotional abuse needs that kind of validation. They need it. They come to us wanting it. And I mean, we're not going to give it if it's not there, but we get that. They need that. They want that. This is important. We're not going to shirk and shy away and say, well, I don't know, it could be this, could be that, not sure. Anyway, all right.
this person writing expresses exactly what you're saying, Dr. Hawkins. So if I were to read the rest, it goes, oh gosh, I've lost my place. Okay. When I ask if such and such situation was abuse, they ask me how I felt and what and how I feel is the priority. If I don't feel good in a situation, whether it qualifies as abuse or not, it's for me to determine my boundaries and what I accept as acceptable for me and what isn't. This is what I've been working on before holiday with my therapist, a psychoanalytic approach. I so want to be validated in my feelings, but my therapist refuses to give in every time. Working on knowing deep down in my gut what's right and wrong, I need to trust these feelings. This is really hard for me. I just want the therapist to say, "You're right. That is abusive behavior. Be done and over with." But my therapist has other plans for me, apparently. My therapist wants me to work on why I need validation so much.
It gets worse.
It's a long
Oh
and
no.
frustrating process, but I've been able to set firmer boundaries with my partner saying, you know what, I don't want this in my life anymore. I don't want to be yelled at anymore. It doesn't always work, though. The partner gets really defensive when I call them out on things. They just want to justify their interactions. It's mostly always my own fault. Gosh, if I was reading this from someone else's point of view, this would be so obvious. Still isn't obvious to me. Back to the drawing board. Sessions starting back next week. That's the end.
I just think it's incredibly irresponsible. It's uninformed, as you said, Jonathan, and it would actually be called double abuse. It would be called, or secondary abuse. It's been called double abuse, secondary abuse. When you go to someone expecting to be helped, that's what double abuse or secondary abuse is. You go to someone expecting to be helped. You seek them out for their credibility, for their credentials, and then you're given this. This is really harmful. I mean, we clinicians have an ethical responsibility to not practice beyond the scope of our expertise. That's in writing. We've all signed different documents that indicate that. And so I would express appreciation for those that are saying, hey, look, this is beyond our expertise. This is emotional abuse. We'll refer out. And I would I challenge myself. I challenge everyone. Let's not practice beyond the scope of what we're, what our expertise is. And then those that have been victimized, if you have any suspicion that you are suffering from emotional abuse, make sure you're with someone that Jonathan just said, trauma informed, and you ask the question, do you have extensive experience with emotional abuse? And the answer should be absolutely. And if it's gosh, I've worked with a lot of different situations, run.
I would also say that a big and we've talked about this before, a big problem that I see with a lot of counseling experiences is that it does not start with an assessment. It doesn't start with any type of evaluation. They just jump in saying, kind of like what the one of the commenters posted of, you tell me what you think is going on and what you want to do about it, and then I'll just follow you and we'll just go from there. And I think that that's really, really poor care. It's really irresponsible. And a lot of these questions, how to spot emotional abuse, how to recognize that happens at the very beginning of a therapeutic relationship, when you're establishing care with a client, and you're asking questions to determine what exactly is the nature of the relationship, and the presence or not of trauma. That's part of that process, and if that isn't happening, it's going to be missed. Huge opportunities are missed.
I
Great
also
point.
want to say that there's a lot right here that we just talked about in the last, 15 minutes that feels like we're bashing other clinicians. But speaking from my own experience, knowing Dr. Hawkins and Jonathan, they're just very protective of people who have been secondarily abused. And this is coming from a place of passion. We have a lot of different outlets between our YouTube and this podcast and blogs to give information to spread awareness on the subject to prevent this from happening further in all clinics. So as you listen to all of this, I hope that if there's any clinicians out there, if you're triggered because you feel that we're calling anyone out, it's not to bash anyone, but to create more information so that, like Jonathan said and Dr. Hawkins said, so that there is proper referrals to the right specialist to get the right care for your clients.
And a quick plug. We will confer with you. We will corroborate with you. We will collaborate with you. We will cooperate with you. We will help educate you. We will be educated by you. So let's work together.
That original question, Katie, I was thinking, going back to what do I look for? How do I determine? I think we've been focusing a lot on the behaviors, the what is abuse, those patterns. Absolutely, that's one of the main things that I focus on. And I like hearing examples from clients, whether or not I'm meeting with them individually or whether or not I'm seeing them as a couple and seeing their responses to each other. I'm looking to name behaviors and those patterns. Another thing that I'm looking for in an evaluation, or when I'm talking to a client, especially when I'm talking to an individual who I suspect or who is the victim of emotional abuse, I'm looking for the impact on them. And so I'm asking about all the basic care needs: sleep, diet, exercise, brain fog, their cognitive function, and if I can compare it in any way, has this changed over time? Has this gotten worse after particular events? I'm looking for a timeline here. Another thing that I'm looking for, whether or not they are describing this to me with cognitive awareness, or whether or not this is just slipping into their speech. I'm looking for the effects of manipulation, gaslighting, emotional abuse. If I hear them defending him, if I hear a defense of his behaviors, he's not all that bad. A lot of the we language, I call that blame sharing. We know the blame shifting, which is like, I'm going to blame you. But when the victim takes on some of the blame, well, I do that too. I'm not exactly perfect. Let me tell you about, and it's not the question I asked. That all, I pay very close attention to language and word choices, and that often it tells me a lot about the, like I said, the effects of psychological abuse on the victim.
One more thing. I'm sure you'd agree with this, Jonathan. When we do our assessments, we also listen for what is happening physiologically. There is an incredibly high likelihood of co-occurrence when someone has been chronically emotionally abused. Their physiology most of the time has also been impacted. What do I mean by that? I mean autoimmune disorders, headaches, sleep disturbance, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, all kinds of physiological problems. What? Gastrointestinal. Yeah, they're feeling it. And if anybody asks the right questions, typically you're getting oh yeah, oh my goodness, I haven't felt well for years. And I'm trying to get to the bottom of that. Oh, okay. So we listen to that in addition to the other symptoms that Jonathan, you just mentioned. But physiology, the body tells the story. The body keeps the score, as we have heard from a good book.
Bessel van der Kolk.
Yeah.
Speaking
Bessel
of
van der
books,
Kolk.
Dr. Hawkins did write a book called In Sickness and in Health
True.
that you could buy on Amazon. Just putting it out there if anyone's interested in the topic.
Right.
He did write a book on it.
All right. Well, robust conversations today. Jonathan, thank you. Katie, thank you. Listeners, if any of this resonates with you, you can always start by visiting our website, www.marriagerecoverycenter.com, to book a free 20-minute phone consultation with one of our trained client care specialists to learn how to get started on getting help. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment and leave us a 5-star review and subscribe to our channel to be notified of upcoming episodes. So, thank you, Jonathan, again. Katie, until next time, this is Dr. David Hawkins signing off for Mad in Love.